Hey fishing friends, today we're going to answer the question I get more than any other question. And the question is, how deep does this lure run? And the answer to that is depends. It depends. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. You know, in the crankbait world, knowing how deep your lure runs, it's a big factor in your success in choosing the right lure for a situation. So it is definitely a good question to ask, but the answer I'm going to give you is going to take you down a road that's going to give you a lot more understanding of how a crankbait is designed and what you fish it off of, how long a cast you make, and there's all kinds of factors involved here. So with that in mind, let's talk about two things to start with in this subject. How deep does a lure run? Well, is it a floater or a sinker? A floating diving lure like this, like the DepthRaider, there's hundreds of crankbaits, whether they're this big or even bigger than this, that are floating divers, okay? Think about this for a second. If you cast a lure out and it floats, if you crank it real slow, where does it go? It stays on the surface. So one of the big factors in how deep a lure goes is the speed. With a floating diver, the faster you go, the deeper the lure. You're driving water force against that diving lip that makes it dive deeper. So floating divers, if you crank them ultra slow, they're actually a surface bait. But if you crank them fast, they dive deep. And how deep do they go from there? We'll talk about that in a second. But I did want to cover this as well. What if the lure is a sinker? Lipless crankbaits sink. Now, cast a lipless crankbait out. Cast these two lures out, this one's going to float. Cast this lure out and engage the reel and don't do anything. What's this lure going to do? Sink to the bottom. The slower you retrieve this lure, the deeper it goes. So think about this for a second. You could work this bait as a surface lure with an ultra slow speed. You can work this bait in as deep in water as you want to by throwing it out, letting it sink to the bottom and cranking it ultra slow. So same speed, two lures called crankbaits, and they run completely different just out of the box because of their design. Now, with that in mind, we're going to just talk about this lure for the rest of this particular series because the lipless crankbait really needs to be talked about on its own. But I just wanted to clarify that point because sinking lures and floating lures really behave differently. Okay, a floating diver. How deep does it go? Like we talked about, speed. Second thing, length of cast. If you make a short cast with a diver and crank it fast, you get like a V motion. In other words, it takes part of your retrieve is taken up getting the lure to diving depth, okay? And if you have a short cast, that lure gets down to maximum diving depth and then you're close to the boat and it's already coming up, so you create a V. So your lure only got to maximum diving depth for a very short period of time. Now, longer cast, that's why some people use long rods and really long casts. A long cast enables you to get the lure deep and then create a graph that looks like this. It goes down, there's no V, it goes down and then it stays down deep, and then as your line gets short as you get to the boat, it starts to come up. So the length of cast makes a difference. So you have speed of retrieve, length of cast, okay? And the third one is diameter of your line, okay? In an exaggerated example here, think about if I was to run really thick, like, rope on this. There's so much resistance when you crank it. There's so much resistance created by the thickness of the rope, the line, that it stops the lure from going deep. And as you thin down the line, the lure runs deeper. Okay, so how do you get the maximum depth out of a lure? Long cast, thin line, fast retrieve. How do you shallow up a deep diver? Thicker line, shorter cast, slower retrieve. Kind of cool, isn't it? Those are dynamics of the crankbait. By the way, all this was covered in my original book, Crankbait Secrets. You can still get copies of that book online. And so, in summary, speed of retrieve, length of cast, okay, and line diameter all are big factors in how deep your lure will run. Now, let's finish with one more thing: trolling. If you're trolling, you're going to get that. You can get more line out. You can get a short cast. You want to make a trolling run with this lure, for example, on a shallower spot. You crank the line and you let very little line out. Okay. If you're hitting the bottom too much, you crank in your line, slow down your speed a little bit, crank in, put less line out on your trolling pass, and you're going to run shallower. You want to run the lure deeper? Put out more line. Put out more line, and the lure will run deeper. You want to get a little bit deeper? Put out more line and put a little more speed on the lure. It'll go deeper. So those are kind of cool things, but it's the basic dynamics of crankbait fishing and the floating diver. So we're going to cover this time. We'll cover the lipless crankbait detail down the road, but those are the things you need to know when you're buying a crankbait, when you're fishing a crankbait, and when you understand that part of it, you can answer the question yourself: how deep is that?